And I'm telling you, the story of Jesus is the most important story we can tell. Last week I said this, and I'm going to repeat it. It's the most important story that we could ever tell. It's a story we need to tell over and over and over again. And not because it's like a classic all-time top 5 story, which it is, but really because it's also our story. We are part of this story. This story has power for us today, and we can enter into it and allow it to transform us. You see, the original story of Jesus that we're reading in the Gospels was first communicated and transmitted by voice. They simply told the story to one another. They recounted Jesus' teachings. They talked about the death and the resurrection. Many of them couldn't even read, even after the Gospels were written down. But for many years, they had no written story of Jesus. They were just telling it and remembering it and holding on to it. Then eventually it was written down in Greek, according to the testimony of folks like John and Mark and Matthew and Luke. The original story that they shared was mostly shared among poor people, struggling people, oppressed people. These were Jews living in Roman-occupied land. They were not the ones with the power. And they heard this story of Jesus, and it just inspired them. It filled them with hope. It gave them strength and courage to keep pushing forward, to keep on keeping on, as folks have said. It helped them keep going, even in the midst of hard times. This story helped them stay on mission in the midst of madness, as Reverend Barber said in a recent sermon I heard. He said, how do we stay on mission in the midst of madness? That's a story it's a question we've got to answer, right? How do we stay on mission in the midst of madness? We enter into the story of Jesus this morning, and we can allow it to transform us, to shape us, and define the way that we live our lives. This morning, our text comes from the Gospel of Luke. We've been in John a lot, but we're moving into Luke for this morning. And this story comes from Luke, which might actually be my favorite gospel. I change my mind a lot, but Luke is just a powerful book. And you may not realize this, but Luke also wrote the book of Acts. And so Luke and Acts are basically one continuous book. It's one story. It's kind of, a lot of us have been watching Netflix and Hulu and things right now. It's kind of like 2 seasons of the same series, right? So you can have this story of the gospel and you've got part 1 or season 1 and season 2. So Luke would be season 1 and Acts is season 2. And here's the hard part is, for those that love the character of Jesus in season 1, you may be a little disappointed because Jesus is only really in part of 1 episode in season 2 because he ends up going up into heaven. And then Acts is really about the apostles and the Holy Spirit, while Luke is about Jesus and what he's been up to. But here's the deal. Jesus is actually all throughout Acts as well. He's all throughout the book of Acts. We don't necessarily see him, but those early Christians immersed themselves so fully in the story of Jesus that they started to live like him. They did what Jesus did. They taught what he taught. The story of Jesus, it changed them. And they ended up looking so much like Jesus that people started calling them the Christ ones, which became the Christians. It'd be nice if people called Christians the Christ ones a little more often nowadays. Too often Christians look way more like other leaders and teachers out there than they do Jesus. And I'm guilty of this too. But the early church, they were trying to be like Jesus. And so Luke lays it out in a clever way. So in Luke, you see Jesus doing a lot. He heals, he teaches, he cares for the poor, he prays a lot, he crosses boundaries, he heals folks, he upsets the powerful. And then what happens is, in Acts, we see those first Christians healing, teaching, caring for the poor, praying, crossing boundaries, upsetting the powerful. They're basically doing all the things Jesus did in Luke. They keep the mission of Jesus going. And one thing that people have pointed out is that at the end of Acts, the last chapter kind of ends in a weird way. It's not resolved. And perhaps that's done intentionally so that we know that the story's not over and that we're actually continuing to live out and continue the mission of Jesus in this world. Those first Christians knew the story of Jesus. They immersed themselves in the story and they allowed it to transform them and shape them and change them. They certainly stayed on mission in the midst of madness. You know, our story today, I heard someone say that it had a surplus of meaning. And that's just a clever way to say that it's got so much depth. There's so many directions we could go, so many messages we could gain from this story. So much good stuff. So let me recap it and break it down for us a little bit. So 2 of Jesus' followers went on a trip to a nearby town of Emmaus. Now Emmaus was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. So Stacy's wondering about the journey. 7-mile journey, maybe like a 3-hour journey. This part of the story where they're traveling on this road, it kind of makes me a little sad and nostalgic because I love to travel. I love to walk. I love to be with people. And it's kind of sad because we can't do a lot of that right now. We're kind of just locked down in our homes and in our neighborhood. And this reminds me of 4 years ago, the best trip I've ever been on, when my wife, Audrey and Isabel as well, and we all went to Spain and we walked on the Camino de Santiago, an ancient pilgrimage. And every day we were walking many miles. And I remember, a 7-mile journey probably would have taken about 2.5 hours, 3-hour walk, depending on how fast we were going. And the story makes me think of that journey. One of the people in this story is named Cleopas. We're not sure who the other person was, but we know that they loved Jesus. They had given their lives to the movement, and now the movement seemed to be over. And so as they walked, they talked about everything that had happened: the arrest, the unjust verdict at the trial, the Roman execution, and also this new development of the empty tomb and the story of the women. Maybe they're asking questions like this: How did all this happen? How did this happen? What went wrong? Could we have prevented this? Why did the Sanhedrin condemn him to death? Did he deserve that? I thought that someone would step up and overturn this. I can't get the images that I saw out of my mind. Did you hear Jesus crying on the cross? What are we going to do now? I don't know if I can keep on going. I don't know if I can keep doing this. What about his mom? Man, I'm not sure that she can get through this. She watched her son executed on a cross. For these 2 disciples, the road home to Emmaus, it was a painful road. And it was a journey plagued with confusion, with fear, with grief, with anguish. While I was on the Camino in Spain, we met people who had lost loved ones, who went through a crisis, and they didn't know what to do. And so they just started walking on this journey. And it was a journey of pain and confusion and grief. And so for these 2 apostles, this journey was a hard one. But something happened on that road. Jesus found them, he caught up to them, and he set them free. And when they thought they were lost, Jesus found them, and he cared for them. So Jesus came up beside them, and he was in disguise. We don't know exactly what was going on here, but they didn't know who it was. They didn't know it was Jesus. And perhaps he shielded himself in some way. Perhaps he had a hood on and was speaking in a different voice. I don't know, but he came in disguise. And I know that Jesus loved these friends of his, and he felt for their sorrow and pain. But I can also kind of see Jesus maybe taking some joy in these moments of meeting his friends and finding them kind of in a low place. But he knows he has this good news of resurrection and new life and salvation. And so he comes up to them, and I imagine he's just excited about this. And he asks them, he's like, hey, what are you guys talking about? And they kind of get smart with him, which they probably regretted after the fact. But they're like, dude, like, are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about what has happened? Apparently this news had spread about this crucifixion of Jesus. It's like if somebody showed up to our church and they wondered why church was canceled. And they showed up and they're like, what? Church is canceled? What are you talking about? Like, why would you cancel church? I'd be like, dude, are you the only one in Lexington who hasn't heard about this pandemic and everything that's going on, right? They're like, dude, like, what are you talking about? Have you not heard? So Cleopas and this other person go on to tell Jesus about Jesus, which is, I think, is just fascinating. They're telling Jesus about Jesus of Nazareth, the one who came with power. They're like, this dude was sent from God, but he was killed. He was killed. And then they said these words. But we had hoped that he was going to redeem Israel. They're like, man, he came in power and might, and he was sent from God. But now, man, we had hoped that he was going to do something. We had hoped he was actually going to redeem Israel. I mean, we believed him. We followed him. We thought he was a prophet. But we had hoped he was going to fix all this mess for our people. I mean, we've said similar things. Perhaps I felt Jesus' presence and I heard him speak to me, but I had hoped he was going to take all my problems away. You know, I believed Jesus could heal me, and he did help me, but I'd hoped he was going to cure my cancer. I had faith that God was going to protect us from this disease, this thing going around everywhere. But then my grandmother got sick and died. I saw Jesus' power. His words seemed so true, but I'd hoped that I wouldn't be tempted to drink anymore. I went to church. I heard the message. I truly believed it, but I'd hoped it would be easier. Have y'all ever said things like that before? But we had hoped that he was going to redeem Israel. You know, I imagine it was strange for Jesus to hear his friends telling him that they had hoped he was going to redeem Israel, when in reality, what he had accomplished over the last 2 days was much greater than their hopes for a restored nation of Israel. What he had accomplished was far greater than that. And so Jesus started to share and break down Scripture with them. He spoke, I mean, I would have loved to hear this teaching. Whatever Jesus was teaching them, I'm sure it was just blowing their minds. He spoke about the Holy Scriptures in a way that inspired them. He went through the Old Testament, began with Moses, and he went through the prophets, and he told them all this stuff. And he likely confused their assumptions about the coming Messiah. The text says that he, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the Scriptures concerning himself. He showed them that their faith actually supported this new thing that Jesus had accomplished. This new reality that they found themselves in. Jesus is like, hey, let's read this Scripture with fresh eyes and see that the Scriptures were actually talking about this and leading us into this moment. That's good theology right there. We need to do a lot of this today. We need to think about our new realities where we find ourselves in and the things that we're facing in our lives and our world and see that the Scriptures actually are speaking to what we're facing. They can breathe new life and fresh life into us even today. This strange man that they met on the road made them feel alive and on fire. He made them feel free, like they could do something. And when they got to that crossroad, they were going to head over to Emmaus. The journey was almost over, but Jesus acted like he was just going to keep walking down the road. And maybe he would have kept walking, but they ended up showing him hospitality. They invited him to come to Emmaus with them, come to their home, and spend the night with them. Maybe they wanted to hear more about what he had to say. Their act of hospitality, you get this, because they were willing to show hospitality to a stranger, it led to a life-changing encounter with a friend. It's a beautiful thing. This can happen in our own lives today. We were in Spain and walking on the Camino. We met a woman named Judy along the way. She was a stranger to us, but we invited her to share dinner with us. And she ended up becoming a friend and ended up blessing us in powerful ways. Hospitality can lead to blessing. During the meal, Jesus took some bread and he broke it and he gave thanks, and immediately they knew who he was. Perhaps they had shared a lot of meals with Jesus. And when they shared that meal, it just kind of came to them. This is Jesus. In their home, I love it. It was in their home. Jesus met them and they were deeply impacted. A lot of us are, kind of holed up in our homes right now. And we may need to meet with Jesus. And I think perhaps Jesus is wanting to commune with you and maybe meet you in your home, even today. After they recognized Jesus, he then disappeared. And I heard some of your wonderings about this. This was probably hard for them, right? But it kind of reminds me of that moment when Mary Magdalene wanted to reach out and hold on to Jesus. She didn't want him to leave. But you know what Jesus said to her? He said, "Don't hold on to me." And to me, this makes me think just how mysterious Jesus is. That Jesus is not going to be pinned down. He's not going to fit our agendas. He's going to be himself. He has a mission and a purpose, and we're a part of that. But Jesus is going to be Jesus, and that's the way he lived his life, and that's the way he is now. He's got his own way of doing things. And after he left, they said these powerful words, and I want to share these with you. They said, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" Were not our hearts burning within us? They met the resurrected Jesus, and their broken hearts became hearts that burn. They met the resurrected Jesus, and their broken hearts became hearts that burn. They immediately, it says, went back to Jerusalem. They were changed. They were trying to get away from Jerusalem. They immediately went back. Jesus didn't show up when and where and how they expected him to show up. They imagined one thing. They had hoped for one thing. And Jesus didn't show up like they thought he would. But the thing that I see in this story is that Jesus still showed up. And I think that all of us can expect Jesus to show up. We can expect him to show up, particularly when we go through dark moments in our lives, when we feel like we can't keep going. The road to Emmaus is not unique to Cleopas and his friend. The road to Emmaus symbolizes all the roads of hopelessness and despair and difficulty that we often travel in our lives. It's a road that we never intend to travel, but it's a road that we all find ourselves on at some point in our lives. We've all traveled the road to Emmaus, and if you haven't yet, you will eventually. And some of you, I bet a lot of us are traveling that road right now. Some of you may have broken hearts this morning. And the encouragement of the resurrection, the encouragement of this beautiful story is that Jesus shows up. I want to share this quote that I read in a study Bible that I just think is so powerful. It says, "Our task is not to figure everything out or to imagine every angle God might come at us from, but to stay on the roads of our years, plodding on, encouraging one another with the voices and mysteries of heaven. It is only that, to stay on the road until God in disguise joins us and eventually comes to sit at our table or we at his." I love this. Our task is not to figure everything out. It's not to imagine every single way that God might come at us from, but to just stay on the road. We know what he's called us to do. To love God, to love others, to be a people of peace, continue to encourage one another, remind each other of these stories and mysteries of heaven, and just rest that this stuff's true, and then wait for God to show up for us in a powerful way. I've noticed that In this time we're in, a lot of people are wanting to find explanations for everything and say, well, the Bible talks about what we're facing right now. To be honest, I don't know if the Bible talks exactly about what we're facing right now. These are mysterious things. Suffering and tragedy and hardship is so mysterious and difficult to understand. And I don't think our job is to try to figure everything out. I've had people try to tell me that, oh, well, this is because of these particular people or these sinners or that the world's gone to crap. We don't have prayer in schools. And I don't think we need to try to worry about figuring all the little details out. We got to trust that God has called us to something, that He is here, and that He can show up for us even in the midst of difficulty and hard times. And if He reveals something to us, great. If He doesn't, let's continue to be patient and trust Him and continue to tell these stories to one another. You know, perhaps you had hoped for something different in your story. Maybe you're on that road to Emmaus and you're struggling. Your story isn't finished. Like I said on Easter, the resurrection means that the worst thing is never the last thing. Jesus desires to come alongside of you, to open your mind, to expand your vision, to empower you to keep marching forward. And I think that if you're open to Him, if you invite Him into your heart and into your home, then He can turn your broken heart into a heart that burns. If you're walking a hard road this morning, then I encourage you to immerse yourself in the story of Jesus. Allow this story to consume you, to envelop you, to embrace you, to guide you. You know, I love the way these two followers of Jesus responded when they met the resurrected Lord. They didn't just stay at home in Emmaus. They went back to Jerusalem, to the place of madness and violence and fear. They went back to the place of the crucifixion, the place that they were trying to get away from. You know, I mentioned black theologian Howard Thurman last week. Martin Luther King Jr. was so inspired by his work, this book, Jesus and the Disinherited, that he had carried it around with him wherever he went. And Howard Thurman says these words, and I want to share them with you as we kind of close out our time. He says, wherever Jesus' Spirit appears, wherever the Spirit of Jesus appears, the oppressed gather fresh courage, for He announced the good news that fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, the three hounds of hell that track and trail the disinherited, need have no dominion over them. He says, when the Spirit of Jesus appears, the oppressed gather fresh courage. And then he goes on to say these words. He says that here we reach the high water mark of prophetic religion, and it is the essence of the religion of Jesus of Nazareth. Of course, God cares for the grass of the field, which lives a day and is no more, or the sparrow that falls unnoticed by the wayside. He also holds the stars in their appointed places. He leaves His mark in every living thing. And He cares for me. To be assured of this becomes the answer to the threat of violence, yea, to violence itself. To the degree to which a man knows this, he is unconquerable from within and without. He's saying that God cares for His creation. He even holds the stars in the skies. His mark is on every living thing, but He also cares for you and He cares for me. And he says that if we can internalize this and understand this and know this deep down, then we truly can be unconquerable from within and without. Those followers of Christ that have come before us, that have displayed incredible courage and strength in the midst of incredible suffering, can inspire and motivate you to keep on moving and keep on fighting. You know, I'm inspired by these stories. They give me hope to continue marching forward. I said this before and I'm going to keep saying it again. Because of Jesus, you are powerful, you are courageous, you are able, you are creative, you are strong, you are steadfast. You can do this. And I'm going to keep repeating this until I believe it, until you believe it, because these were true words that often we find it hard to believe. Because of Jesus, you are powerful, you are courageous, you are able, you are creative, you are strong, you are steadfast, and you can do this.